Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the show, Science Facts and Fallacies, episode 242. Very excited, as always, to be here. My name's Cameron English. I'm your host, joined by my faithful co-host, Dr. Liza Dunn, bringing all the facts, explaining everything so everyone understands what's going on. How are you, Liza? What's going on?
I am well. I just drove 2,200 miles across the country, and we got a flat tire and had to drive. Well, actually, it was a cracked rim, and we had to fill up the tire in the middle of nowhere, Minnesota, and we had to fill up the tire every 15 miles as we limped down to Chicago. So I'm still married. He was a real sport, though.
Maybe that's a sign of a great marriage to come, because that will test your patience. That'll test your mettle. Every 15 miles, yeah, I might punch something.
We did fine. He's a keeper.
All right. Well, that's good to hear. I'm glad you guys made it home okay, because moving is such a pain in the ass. So good for you guys. In any case, 3 stories as always. Really great stuff this week. This last one's going to be tough. I'm just warning everyone. It might rub you the wrong way, but that's okay, because that's what we should do in science, is challenge people's ideas. All right. So let's get into it. So first up, BBC corrects its misleading educational site hyping the benefits of organic farming and the alleged environmental problems of GMOs. Next up, happy 41st birthday to genetically engineered insulin. Your approval by the FDA in 1982 took 5 months. How many years would it take now? And finally, brace yourselves, everyone. Scientific American has become a scientific sewer, in quotes, promoting ideological rubbish on the evolution of male-female differences. Oh boy. All right. Let's start with the good stuff first, and then we'll work our way up to this painful topic we're going to discuss. So this is a story published at the Genetic Literacy Project by Science for Sustainable Agriculture, and they are a think tank that just throws grenades at people that say nonsense on the internet. That's the best way I can put it, is they respectfully, but they go after the media, as they did BBC in this case, and they go after different websites, and they just say, hey, let's tell the truth, okay? If this stuff is so bad, if farming is so bad, don't make up nonsense. So as the headline gives away, BBC has this website. It's sort of this educational themed website, and they put an article up there about organic farming. And they had all kinds of typical tropes that we've talked about year after year, episode after episode on the show. And the thing that's alarming about it is that the website is geared at undergrad college students. So you have these young people who are smart, but they don't know very much, which is why they're going to school, and they're being effectively force-fed things that are just false. So a couple examples. The website, and this is a direct quote, though, the website said, intensive farming reduces biodiversity, so all the animals and plants and stuff around a farm, and increases pollution. They also claim that organic milk and beef are produced without using antibiotics, and organic farmers do not apply pesticides to their crops. Okay, so outright silliness here. And I'll stop, but the happy ending in this case, which almost never happens. I deal with the press a lot in the work that I do. They almost never own up to their mistakes. So this is a great example. Science for Sustainable Agriculture reached out to BBC and they said, these are falsehoods. You need to take these off. And to their credit, they said, oh, you know what? We were wrong about that. Our bad. And then they updated the article and they issued a correction. And I'm glad to hear that. So that's the brief summary. That's the good news. That's how it ended. And then we can talk a little bit about the specifics of this, Liza. So what did you think?
Well, yeah, I think I was absolutely stunned that BBC said, oh, yeah, our bad, whoopsie. I almost wanted to go see if anybody needed their temperature taken because that's so rare that people will own up to their mistakes. But they did. And so hopefully that has a knock-on impact. I do think people are starting to listen a little bit more about the controversies and are listening to maybe both sides a little bit more. And that might be because of the fallout from Sri Lanka. People have started to see that there are actual very significant ramifications for if you make poor agricultural policy. So BBC is an international news organization, and so hopefully they kind of looked at some of the commentary around what happened in Sri Lanka when people did go all organic, and and the collapse of the economy after that. So suddenly, so I think I'm very happy that they did that and that they were reasonable.
Yeah, a couple of things that I don't know who they sourced this material from. I could guess, but I'm not sure. But a couple of these are probably amusing because a lot of folks aren't aware of them. So one of them is that organic livestock farmers do not use antibiotics. You think about that, that's kind of weird because that's a very common medicine. Animals get infections all the time, bacterial infections, and they'll get really sick and they'll infect their friends, whatever.
Yes.
They will infect the animals that they live with, and then they can die. So you have to treat them. So the idea that they're not treated with antibiotics is kind of silly. It's a weird marketing thing.
And it's also, yeah, and it's also when you think about animal welfare.
Right.
You really want to. The claim is that animal ag is so destructive, and it's not. People who are involved in animal ag don't care for the health and well-being of their animals. Well, of course they do, and so that's why they use antibiotics. And they often use most of the antibiotics they use actually don't have human uses either.
Mm-hmm.
So they are not. That's a false claim anyway, long and short. And it's important to be using the most advanced techniques and technology for taking care of your animals from an animal welfare perspective.
Yeah, it's so funny to me. It's almost like the organic lobby thinks they're the only people that have thought of antibiotic resistance.
Right.
In reality, the FDA, I think this was in 2018, they banned, and it was already being cut in the industry anyway, but they banned the use of medically important human antibiotics. So the ones that we use the most for ourselves, you can't use those in animal agriculture. You can't use antibiotics to boost animal growth, or
Nope.
just as you can't, like, as a prophylactic or whatever. Like, you can't use it unless they're sick, and they have to be
Yep.
prescribed by a veterinarian. And before the animal goes to slaughter, it has to be completely out of their system. So there's lots of regulatory, restrictions in place. This doesn't just happen willy-nilly, and I think people should know that. Okay, a couple other that we can dive into here. We've talked about the pesticide thing ad nauseum. Organic farmers use pesticides. They're typically older. Sometimes they're much more toxic. Sometimes you have to use them in greater quantities than the synthetic scary chemicals, which is a dumb word, by the way. Synthetic versus natural. The distinction means nothing in this context. It's a
That's
chemical.
right.
It's a chemical. It's just like the toxicity is not impacted by whether it's natural or not.
Technically speaking, these chemicals tend to be organic. They have carbons and hydrogens and things like that. So if you know about organic chemistry, you know that, technically speaking, many of these are organic products.
Right.
But not in the marketing sense, in the actual scientific sense.
Right. In the mythological sense, they are not organic. Right. In the real sense, they are indeed organic, as are all living things, like most things. No, but in all seriousness, you have chemicals, and they're not terrible. I mean, sometimes there are uses, but you have copper, which is used as a fungicide, which it has a purpose. I think the problem, we discovered it was a problem because it was being used extensively and intensively, and I want to say in France, and particularly in the wine industry.
In the wine industry, and there are occupational health hazards if you use it the wrong way. So if you aren't properly, don't have proper PP and things like that, and you spray it all the time, you can get what's it called? It's a fibrosis of the lungs, and you get copper deposits in the lungs, and it actually winds up causing vineyard sprayer's lung is what it's called. And you get scarring, and that can lead to cancer. And then there's also, you can get angiosarcoma of the liver with that too. But once again, if you're using it properly, not a problem. If you're not using it properly, you can have environmental impacts and you can have health impacts. So you have to. These are all regulated, even if they are uh, organic or not organic. They're all regulated.
Sure. And by the way, I should say, I'm sure the formulation is different, but if you go to like a home and gardening store, you can buy copper to treat fruit trees and stuff. That
Yeah.
like we have to do that every year because we have a mandarin tree, and there's these weird little critters that climb on it every year, and I don't know what disease it is, but they inject some kind of nasty fungus or something into my
Yeah.
mandarin tree, and the only way to mitigate it is to spray it with copper, and then use like a power hose and blast the bugs off the tree, which is kind of fun to do. But all that to say, it's not that the chemical itself is scary. It's just that don't lie about it.
That's exactly right.
Okay. Well, I guess good ending on that one. BBC, for all of the silliness they do publish, so like, whoops, we got that one wrong. So even a
Yeah.
broken clock is right. All that. So next story. This is super cool. This is one of the stories that I first read years ago, and I went, "This is such an awesome technology. I want to learn more about this." Um, and it sort of undermines the GMOs are unnatural, biotechnology is unnatural, and you should be scared of it thing. And this is, of course, the approval of insulin, human insulin. The brand name is Humulin. It was approved in 1982 by the FDA. Um, and our friend, our mutual acquaintance, I guess you could say, Dr. Henry Miller with the American Council on Science and Health, was the medical reviewer at the FDA at the time. So his team of scientists and regulators, they looked this over and approved it in record time in 5 months. And so that's the premise of the article here. So I'll just give a couple quick basics and then you can explain all the details. But insulin was first discovered, I want to say, in the early 1920s, 1922.
Yes.
But it came from pigs and cows.
Mhm.
Right, these animals would go to slaughter, and then you would take their pancreases, and you could extract insulin. But you had to do it's like tons and tons of pig and cow
I think
parts.
it's something like 2 tons to get 8 ounces, like
Right,
a can of
right,
Coke, right?
yeah.
Or less than a can of Coke.
It's absurd, right? So you can see why that's probably not sustainable. And I think it was in the 1960s or so. There people were worried about a real shortage of insulin because you have to get so many animal parts to produce the amount that diabetics actually need. And I think because we have so much of it today, even if it is really expensive for other reasons, it's available. And Dr. Miller includes a picture in this of a boy. He's like 5 or 6 years old, and it was before he had access to insulin, and he's just shriveled away to nothing. And then
Yes.
after getting a steady supply of insulin, he bulked up to a normal weight and he looks very healthy. So I think we forget that this in many ways could be a death sentence for people not having access to this drug.
Well, diabetes, type 1 diabetes had 100% mortality rate within weeks of diagnosis prior to the discovery of insulin, and its mass production. It was uniformly fatal. It's starvation in the face of plenty because even though you eat sugar, right, you wind up not being able to get it into your cells. And because you can't get it into your cells starve. And so you wind up breaking down muscle and fat and things like that, and getting completely dehydrated because the excess sugar goes out in the urine and takes a lot of water with it, so you get dehydrated. So the symptoms of type 1 diabetes are excessive thirst, lots and lots of urine, rapid weight loss, and lots of times kids come in with something called the diabetic ketoacidosis, and you can smell on their breath ketones, and that's because the body is breaking down fats and proteins as an alternate source of energy. So they look, when they're very, very thin like that and wasted like that little boy in that picture, they look like they're starving, and that's because they literally are starving. Yeah, so it was uniformly fatal diagnosis within weeks of diagnosis at, uh, prior to the discovery of insulin.
Yeah, Henry calls it quite literally a miracle drug
It is.
because of it's incredible. So now here's the cool part of the story. This is in the early 1970s. We're just starting to get a grasp of recombinant DNA technology, or genetic engineering, as it's popularly called today. And again, Liza can explain this in more detail. But in essence, you had a lot of smart people figure out that you could use certain enzymes to cut out a segment of DNA, add it to bacterial DNA, and then add that to another species of bacteria, and then the bacteria reproduces, and then it mass produces whatever hormone or enzyme or protein, whatever gene that you originally moved. And so that's what happened with insulin, is they figured out how to do this recombination stuff. And then they fermented these bacteria, these GE bacteria, and then they produced as much insulin as they wanted. So it's just incredible. And this is kind of like with the spark that went on in my mind. I'm like, wait a minute, they just moved DNA around.
They moved
and it works.
DNA around.
It's incredible. So take a second, explain what's going on there, if there's anything you'd like to add.
So for a couple of things. So let's just start real quick with the animals and what went on with the animals, and then we can get over to how that changed, revolutionized things. So first of all, porcine, you used to get insulin from pork or pigs and cattle, and you needed, as diabetics survived, you needed more and more cattle and pork and pigs pancreases to keep up with the production. And so it went from being an absolutely 100% fatal to disease to a manageable disease that people could live with. Now, there are a couple of things that went with that. You had to deal with animal welfare. You had to deal with a whole bunch of purifying processes when you're getting the islet cells out of the tissue. It was a big, huge manufacturing deal to be able to get this insulin in high quantities out of these pancreases. And so when they figured out that if you go back to the way DNA works, the recipe for insulin which is a protein, comes from your DNA. So a gene in your DNA is transcribed and made into insulin, right? And it comes out of the cell and does its thing. So they discovered the genes that would do that. Now, the genes from pigs and cattle are slightly different than the genes from people, right? And so sometimes you would have a little bit of a mismatch because it's not quite the same protein. So you could, theoretically, some diabetics would make antibodies to that protein, right? So they wouldn't, because it came from a different species. And so they would start to, have refractory hyperglycemia, too much sugar. So they were having harder time treating with that. So that could happen. Allergic things could happen because once again, a different species. So those were very rare side effects, but they did happen. And it required a huge manufacturing process. So if you could go from needing big livestock to make your insulin to have bacteria become insulin-making factories, insulin-producing factories, that was just incredible. So when they figured out which genes had the recipe for making insulin, they were able to take that DNA and put it into the bacterium, right? And then the bacterium started being able to use its own machinery to make insulin. And it made it much more easy to purify, and you could make it in much greater quantities. And it was human insulin, right? So it was, because it was human insulin, you had less risk of any of these refractory like immune responses to the actual insulin itself, the actual protein itself.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible. The other aspect of it that is instructive, I think, is the fact that Henry was at the FDA at the time, and so he, for one reason or another, he's if you never talk to him, you do it before just send him an email or something. He's really, really sharp guy. He's very nice, but he doesn't beat around the bush, So I could imagine him in the FDA going, and by the way, he says that the paperwork, because there was no internet at the time, right? So there was no electronic submission form, right? So there's like a giant stack of medical review information and science and clinical research, like just an absurd room full of stuff that they've got to get through. It was him and a handful of other FDA scientists. And they got through it in 5 months. And I think he says at the time, this is in the early 1980s, the average approval time for a new drug was 30 and a half months, or the medical review, 30 and a half months, which is ridiculous. So they got through it, and so he's like, okay, we got this, we're good. So he goes to his boss, and his boss says, it's only been 5 months, we can't approve this yet. If something goes wrong, they'll blame us. And Henry's like, what are you talking about, dude?
This is miraculous stuff.
Right. But and there's something interesting there about the mindset of a bureaucrat and public choice economics and we can get into that in a second. But Henry's boss goes on vacation. I just love this kind of rebel attitude. He goes to his boss and he's like, "Hey, we're all set." And the guy goes,
Yeah.
"Okay, let's do it." And of course, it's been on the market now for however many 40 years or whatever.
41 years, yeah.
Yeah, right. And I mean, it was thoroughly reviewed. They did all the proper research, and we have all this real life experience now. It works great, and every diabetic uses it, I think.
Yes,
most,
yeah,
I should say.
yes, and they've been able to tweak it so you have shorter acting insulins that you can use to like right after you eat. They've got longer acting insulin, so you have a baseline level and stuff like that. So it's really a miraculous drug. But now it takes anywhere from 10 to 15 years to get a drug on the market, and possibly a life-saving drug. And the reason why they push this is a life-saving drug, and this is an incredible technology, right? But there are so many similar drugs that are in the pipeline being worked through, and it takes $2.5 billion to get a drug on the market, right? And 10, 15 years of intensive study and lots of testing and things like that. So getting through those regulatory hoops are pretty incredible. Now, I think that, with the mRNA vaccines, that was unbelievable technology that we were able to show that you can definitely streamline that process if you've got the right forces in play. The problem is that people now do not trust because of this kind of anti-science thinking, and because of some of the mistakes made during COVID, which were not mistakes made by the vaccine, but some of the policies that were created during COVID, I think, in retrospect, made people really suspect, not trust the regulatory system, and that's really unfortunate.
Yeah. The vaccine didn't shut down your kid's school or pick and choose who could go to rallies.
Yeah, and the scientists who were making the vaccine all wanted their kids to go to school. They didn't want to get COVID. They didn't want to get sick, and so that's the frustrating part about that.
Yeah, the fascinating thing for me is what he calls it the bureaucratic mindset. This idea, because a lot of people have this mythology, and I think the FDA itself kind of perpetuates this. If you read their marketing material about how awesome they are and why you should give them more money each year, the idea is, right, you have these objective scientists, and they're up here, and they're going to look at the data, and they're not affected by politics because they have tenure or whatever the bureaucratic equivalent of tenure is. So they can't be fired, and they're supposed to be objective, and they're just going to follow the science, and you can't trust those greedy pharma companies because those bastards are up to no good. That's why we got the FDA. And then when you get an inside look, you go, oh, wait a minute. Actually, there's a lot of political pressure, and they often do things. Sometimes it's good, like in the case of COVID, like the government was not going to be like, oh, yeah, take 10 years. We'll just hang out here with our masks, and we'll hang out in our house, right? That's not going to happen.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Right. So anyways, federal agencies, very subject to political pressure. And of course, the people there have reputations and they want to succeed in their careers. And so if they can see that there's a risk in a decision and they can avoid it, even if it potentially puts someone's life on the line, they're so far removed up from it that they don't care. And that's what Henry's describing. And that's what in economics it's called public choice theory. And all it says, in essence, is people in the public sector, politicians, regulators, they respond to the same incentives, right? They like success, and they like money, and they like being famous. They're humans, right? So even if they work in the government, those incentives don't just disappear for them. And this is exactly what you're seeing. So I think this is also, it's a secondary aspect of the story, but it's good for people to see that this is what happens.
That's right.
Okay. Just really great stuff. So we can stop there and go on to it's going to be a tough story, everyone. I'm sorry. Yeah. I'm just assuming that it's not a tough story. I think it's funny and entertaining and informative. But we're talking here. This is a story by Jerry Coyne. He's an evolutionary biologist at the University of Chicago. I've never met him and I don't know him, but I just imagine him as like this old, crusty scientist who like is looking at ant colonies, and then someone's like, sex is a spectrum. He's like, what are you talking about? That's my impression. I'm sure he's awesome. I'd love to have him on the show if we can arrange that. But in any case, he has this blog that he's written for years. It's called Why Evolution is True. And you could tell what it's about from that. But in recent years, he's kind of turned his attention to this I don't know, whatever you want to call it, this whatever ideology is pushing certain sex is a spectrum, gender is a social construct, et cetera, et cetera. And people can believe that, but his opposition to it is that it's encroaching into biology, and people are just being expected to say, "Oh yeah, we've always known this." I mean, we haven't talked about it until 4 years ago, but it's we've. So he's one of the few biologists that's really taken exception to some of these claims. And here he's talking about an article. This was the lead or the cover story for a recent edition of Scientific American, and it was called Women Hunters, I think.
Yeah.
And they're trying to undo or challenge this idea that in our evolutionary past, men were hunters and women were
Homemakers.
homemakers and mothers, and they stayed back while the men did the manly man stuff, right? So they are the authors, and they are scientists as well, but they're kind of pushing back on this idea that women evolved to be second-class citizens. And I think this is important. Is what Dr. Coyne's saying. He's like, that's not what's at issue here, right? The issue of equality or women's equality or anyone's equality, right? That's a moral issue, and that's not contingent. That's not contingent upon anthropological data about hunting, right? It doesn't come down to that. So like, and it's really important that people stress that, because sometimes when you get into these discussions, people say, well, you're anti-woman. It's like, no one's anti. Just shut up.
No
right?
one's anti-woman. That's right.
Right. So his point is like, look, there's no amount of data on who hunted back in the day that's going to say, okay, well now women have no rights because they didn't hunt, right? Like no one's making that argument. So that's the point that he's making from the outset. But basically the SciAm article is saying, look, we have this new data that shows that there were women that hunted, right? They would go out in the hunting parties, and therefore, there's no difference in strength between men and women, and everyone believes this myth because of sexism and because of patriarchy or whatever, right? So I'll let you dive in and talk about the science, but the alternative hypothesis that Dr. Coyne puts forward is that, well, there are actual differences, biological, physiological differences between men and women, and it comes down to sex selection for mating preferences, right? So women find certain traits in men attractive for whatever reason. I don't care, whatever theory you push is fine. There's lots of competing ideas. But women effectively select for men that are bigger and stronger and faster. And from an evolutionary perspective, you can say, oh, well, that makes sense, right? You want someone who's big and strong, who's going to, right, kill the saber tooth when it comes for your baby or whatever, right?
Right.
And so over time, this leads to, and of course, this is no like secret, sexist conspiracy. It's just biology, right?
It's biology.
And so people are it's sort of a natural division of labor where it's like, well, I'm bigger and faster, so I'll go do this, and you birth babies. So you do that, right? It's like it's not even a choice almost. So that's the alternative he points out, and he comes down to the conclusion and says, let's just follow the science, to use a cliche at this point, and we don't it doesn't have to influence our politics in any way.
Yeah, I think that this discussion is one of the things that has actually undermined the public's acceptance of scientific principles more than anything, is this exact discussion. They look at, non-scientists look at sex as binary, right? There are men and there are women. Every once in a while, there's a little intersex question, and that's extraordinarily rare. I think it's 0.018%, right? And so discussions can go around that, but long and short is that is it. One. And so when they hear scientists say that, sex is not binary, and the idea that it is binary is discriminating against women, they go, well, what, you're telling me the Earth's not flat either, right? I'm supposed to believe in evolution. I'm supposed to believe the Earth is a sphere. I'm supposed to believe in all these scientific principles, except for this one thing that is absolutely true. And I know this from my whole existence, except for the past 4 years. And now all of a sudden, it's not supposed to be true, and it's discriminating against some group if it's all of a sudden if you point to it as truth. Now, the other thing that I don't understand is the marginalization of having babies and raising babies and because you know what? That's a superpower. Men donate one dinky little cell, that one dinky little cell,
One
and then
stupid little gamete.
that's exactly right. And then women grow this, take their cell, but then everything else comes from mom, right? And that is a superpower. And that is why human beings exist, because of motherhood. And I think that if people gave motherhood its due respect, I think that we would hold mothers in much higher esteem. I think I saw several years ago, I saw a what it would cost to be a mom, and it was a video where it was a job interview, and people were applying for this management position, and the management position meant that you had to be on call 24/7, 365. You had to do the boss's, being the child's, the laundry. You had to, feed. They have three meals a day. You had to drive them everywhere. And with the job description, you'd see these people that looking at this job description, going, "Oh my God, how do I tell this person I don't want this job?" Tell this person that sounds like a really hard job. And the interviewer was like, "Well, that's motherhood." And they were like, "Oh my gosh," and had a newfound respect for their mothers. So I think that people really need to understand how critical it is for civilization that there is good child rearing, and it is just as important as any male job. And people underestimate how important it is, and they think it's a negative when people say it's an important job. And I think that that's where this whole anthropologic discussion has gone. And I think it's really, really unfortunate, because that's how you keep society stable. Scientifically, really important, scientifically, two sexes. Yes, I understand that there's gender dysphoria. Yes, I understand that, some people have these ideas, but that's separate than the reality of males and females. And males, hormones and hormone receptors are very different than women's hormones and hormone receptors. They've got unique features that balance each other, right? And that's the way. That's what reality is.
This is another quote from Coyne. He's actually he's blogged about this a lot, but he's also published some peer review papers, because he's just so infuriated with this whole movement that he's just, he's like, I'm trying to safeguard my profession. It's him and a handful of other people in that field, like Colin Wright is another evolutionary biologist who's well known for this. But Coyne writes, sex is binary in all animals. In humans, for example, the frequency of exceptions, as you alluded to the binary is only 0.018%, or one person in 5,600. This is about the same probability of flipping a nickel and having it land on its edge. But we don't say heads, tails, or edge when calling a coin toss. For all practical purposes, sex is binary. I don't understand what the controversy is. I think the problem is that we've allowed ourselves to start defining truth by what people want to believe or what people feel instead of what we know.
Yes.
And we don't do that universally, right? For example, and we saw this a lot during COVID, right? When it came to debunking, anti-vaccine misinformation. I hate that word. Can we just stop with the I hate that word. Anyways, when it came to that, right, all of a sudden, objective truth was a thing again. It's like, no, the vaccine was studied for this long. It has this specific effect. It does not have these side effects. Science, blah, 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 right? We know all these things objectively, and then it comes to like, okay, so there's only men and women, right? Well, I mean, that's a complex sociological question, and I'm a biologist, and I can't really tell you. But, it's like, just why do we have to do this, right? Why do we have to tie ourselves in knots? You like, if you want to be trans, then carpe diem, right? Do whatever you want. It's not that big of a deal, I don't think, at least on that specific question. But right, we have to pretend that everyone's always known that this is true. It's like, no one knows this is true because it's not.
That's exactly right. And once again, I think it is at the foundation of undermining people's trust in science, because the same people who scold people for saying that for having a faith, for example, will go completely. This is on faith. This is an anthropology claim. This is not a scientific claim. So people lose their jobs, and people are scared to stand up. I think doctors have been scared to stand up and talk about things like this because they're afraid of the ramifications. There are real ramifications if you do go against the grain with this.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. A couple of just some odds and ends from the story that are really important, I think. The first is that, kind of to the point you were just making, is that within anthropology or within evolutionary biology, this is an ongoing discussion, and it seems that there are a lot of people with the appropriate expertise critiquing this female hunter idea, and they're just saying, well, look, we have this data. It looks like there's some evidence that in some tribes or some communities, women hunted smaller animals or they trapped smaller animals. But that's not the same thing as chasing down a buffalo or whatever, right? Like
Right.
throwing a giant spear at an animal that could trample over you. It's not the same thing, and it's not a bad thing to point that out. It's just different.
Different.
It's okay, right? Has nothing
Yeah.
to do with equality. And then sort of building on what Coyne says is that you do have these intersex conditions, as they're called, but those don't correlate to people's gender identities. So, like, if you ask someone what their gender is and they go, "Well, I'm a Zer or whatever," they're not
Yeah.
intersex. Almost certainly not, right?
No,
And if you
that's right.
ask the advocates of this ideology if they want science to bolster their ideas, most of them will say no, because it's my
Right.
lived experience and it's my truth, and I don't need your bioessentialism, as they call it, right? So all of it's that's what amuses me the most is all of these academics are like, we're gonna, like Neil deGrasse Tyson, we're gonna give a scientific case for trans identity, and they're like, we don't want it, right? We don't want your science, polluting our stuff. So, anyways,
Yeah.
anyway.
Yep. No, they're all on the socio-cultural kind of thing, right? So, yeah, and I just, once again, I think it undermines our credibility, and I think it's unfortunate. I think it's unfortunate.
Okay, we'll send all your angry letters to Liza, and I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. I will happily take if people have questions or thoughts about what we've just talked about. Happy to discuss those.
Yeah, we'll
I think
talk
this
about
is.
them.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
So we'll talk about them anytime. Yes,
Yes.
we're happy to answer questions.
Yeah, and I think it's getting better over time. It seems slowly but surely there are people willing to have these kind of conversations. But this is how we kind of turn away the silliness, right? Like evolution's a fact, and also there's unlimited sex. It's like, how does that work exactly? Like, you know what I mean? Like, let's just shine some light and pour some salt on this, and we're gonna get over this. Anyways, that'll do it for us.
All
Thank you
right.
for joining us as always. We'll be back next week for 243. Follow us on social media. It's at Dr. Liza Dunn on Twitter, X, whatever, at CamJ English, and at Genetic Literacy for the Genetic Literacy Project. Go to their website, read their content, because they put this on for us, and they're awesome, and we really appreciate it. So thank you, GLP. Everyone have a great week. See you next time.